The insane moon landing plan. A deep dive. Humanity's journey to the moon wasn't just a simple point a rocket and go scenario. It was an incredibly complex and risky mission that required solving problems no one had ever faced before. The plan NASA devised for the Apollo program was, in many ways, insane, both in its ambition and execution. Here's how it all worked. From the grand vision to the mind-bending technical challenges and split-second decisions that made it happen. The challenge: getting to the moon and back. Before the Apollo program, the US and the Soviet Union were locked in the space race. The Soviets had taken the lead with Sputnik, the first satellite, and Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space. The US needed to pull off something bigger. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy announced a goal that seemed almost impossible: landing a man on the moon and bringing him back safely before the decade was over. At the time, NASA had only just figured out how to send a human into orbit for a few minutes. Going all the way to the moon, about 384,400 kilometers, 238,855 miles away, was an entirely different beast. To put this in perspective, no spacecraft had ever traveled that far. No one knew how to land on another celestial body and take off again. Engineers had to build a spacecraft that could survive deep space, re-enter Earth's atmosphere at insane speeds, and land safely. And they had to do it in less than a decade. The insane plan: Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. NASA engineers debated multiple ways to reach the moon. Here were the three main ideas. 1. Direct ascent. A single massive rocket would fly straight to the moon, land, and then take off back to Earth. This was the simplest idea, but required an impossibly large rocket. 2. Earth Orbit Rendezvous. Two rockets would be launched into Earth's orbit. They would dock together, forming one spacecraft, then head to the moon. This method was feasible, but still required enormous launches. 3. Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, LOR, a multi-stage approach where a smaller lunar module, LM, would detach from the main spacecraft, land on the moon, then return and dock with the command module before heading back to Earth. LOR was by far the most insane idea. It required designing a completely new kind of spacecraft that could dock in lunar orbit, something never done before. Building a lander that could work in an environment with no atmosphere and 1/6 of Earth's gravity. Training astronauts to fly two separate vehicles, one of which had to land on an alien world with no help from mission control. Despite the risks, NASA chose Lunar Orbit Rendezvous because it required the least fuel and was the most efficient in terms of weight. But this decision meant they had to design and test entirely new spacecraft from scratch. The hardware: 3 vehicles, 1 mission. NASA developed the Saturn V rocket, the most powerful machine ever built, to carry the Apollo spacecraft into space. The spacecraft itself was divided into 3 parts. 1. The Command Module, CM. Columbia. This was the main spacecraft where the astronauts lived for most of the journey. It housed navigation, communication, and life support systems. It was the only part that returned to Earth. 2. The Service Module, SM. Attached to the Command Module, it contained fuel, oxygen, and the main engine. This provided the thrust needed for course corrections and getting back to Earth. 3. The Lunar Module, LM. Eagle, a lightweight lander designed for the moon's weak gravity, had 2 stages, a descent stage to land and an ascent stage to launch back up. Was designed to work only in space, meaning it had no heat shield and couldn't return to Earth. Each of these parts had to work perfectly together, or the astronauts would die in deep space. The mission: Apollo 11's Insane Journey 1. Launch: July 16, 1969. The Saturn V rocket blasted off from Kennedy Space Center. It carried Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. After reaching Earth orbit, they fired the engines to send them toward the Moon. 2. 3 days in deep space. The crew traveled through the void of space, facing extreme radiation and temperatures. They had to do a critical mid-course correction. If they got the angle even slightly wrong, they could miss the Moon entirely or crash into it. 3rd, lunar orbit and the risky landing, July 20, 1969. Armstrong and Aldrin transferred into the Lunar Module, Eagle, leaving Collins alone in the Command Module, Columbia. As they descended toward the Moon, everything started going wrong. Alarms were going off in the spacecraft's computer, overloaded with data. The landing site was too rocky, so Armstrong had to manually pilot the lander with only seconds of fuel left. They touched down with just 17 seconds of fuel remaining. Armstrong radioed the famous words, "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." 4. Walking on the Moon. Armstrong stepped onto the surface, saying, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." Aldrin followed, and they spent 2.5 hours exploring the surface, collecting rocks, and setting up experiments. The U.S. flag was planted, though it later fell over when they took off. The terrifying ascent. If the lunar module's engine failed, Armstrong and Aldrin would be stranded forever. They fired the ascent engine, leaving the bottom half of the Eagle behind. They successfully docked with Columbia in lunar orbit. 6. The journey home. After jettisoning the lunar module, they fired the engine to break out of lunar orbit. They traveled 3 more days back to Earth. The command module re-entered Earth's atmosphere at 25,000 miles per hour, enduring temperatures of 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on July 24th, where they were picked up by the USS Hornet. The legacy, an impossible dream. Achieved Apollo 11 was a miracle of engineering, bravery, and luck. The insane plan worked. Barely. Over the next few missions, NASA refined the process, but every moon landing remained a high-risk endeavor. Even today, no other nation has sent humans to the Moon. The plan was so complex, and the risk so high, that it's still one of the greatest technological achievements in human history. And the craziest part? They did it with computers less powerful than a modern smartphone.